back to WhitTips. Today we're going to be looking at William Shakespeare's play, The Tragedy of Macbeth. We're going to be focusing on the theme of the supernatural and in more detail looking at the witches and how Shakespeare uses these throughout his play. Before we start to look at the witches, let's focus on these three terms that we've got on the screen at the moment. So we've got natural, unnatural and supernatural. Obviously we're looking at the theme of the supernatural in the play. Before we do that, let's consider the root of that word natural then. Something that's derived from nature and really something that's normal, okay, something that we would expect perhaps, okay, so we've got lots of natural occurrences in the play. Something that's unnatural is something that goes out of the ordinary course of nature, as it says here, something we might refer to as something that's abnormal, okay, but still within the realms of our comprehension. When we look at this final word here, supernatural, then we're moving beyond our comprehension, we're moving beyond nature, if you will, beyond the naturally human form into something that's slightly more special perhaps, something that's slightly more magical, something that's beyond the realms of human comprehension. And that's where a lot of the witches fall later on in the play here, into this realm of the supernatural. And also there's lots of other supernatural events that we'll look at in future videos within this play that Shakespeare deploys for various different reasons. So whenever students write about witches in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, they often link them to King James's fascination with witches and said that he put them in there just to please King James. He was fascinated by witches, we can't deny that, and before he ascended the throne of England in 1597 he produced a book in Scotland called Demonology, where he set out lots of guidance on how to spot witches, how to deal with witches, and the role and the dangerous role that witches play within society. So he was terrified by the thought of them. He was a very superstitious king and man, and he thought that witches were responsible for a tempestuous storm that he endured at sea once, where hyperbolically he thought he was going to die and his life was in danger, and he blamed that at the door of witchcraft. During his reign, thousands and thousands of people stood trial for witchcraft, and in 1604 he managed to make that a capital offence. So it's important to understand what a Jacobean audience member would have understood and viewed as the term witch, because it's changed very much from a witch today. A lot of the stereotypical and conventional witch type behaviours were similar, but then there were some things that were very, very different. For example, Jacobean witches were often elderly women, they were often poor, they were often widows, they were marginalised on the fringes of society, and didn't really have much use. They didn't really work or contribute too much to society, so they were kind of a little bit of a burden as well. So they were often a little bit odd, a little bit strange, spinsters, people that had never married and often then kept pets for company, and we'll come on to that a little bit later on. But they were very much marginalised, very much cast out by society, and very much living on the fringes. A lot of things that we understand about witches, some of them are not true. Things like they were burnt at the stake. Witches were not really burnt at the stake. If they were found to be a witch, it wasn't really a burn of the stake, it was more of a hanging. The water test and the drowning test that we often talk and hear about, whether if they float they're a witch, if they drown then they're not, that was something that was carried out as a kind of crude witch-like test, where a lady may have her hands bound behind her back and her feet tied together, thrown into water, a pond, a pool, or a river, and if they sank to the bottom, then they were not a witch, and if they floated and the water rejected them, then they were a witch. But they were not as common by any stretch of the imagination as much as confessions. Most people that were found to be witches confessed, sometimes willingly, sometimes out of mental disorders, but a lot of them out of forced confessions. And a lot of them, or the majority of them, were punished under the following crime, which is mischief following anger. Just to explain that to you, it is pretty much as it sounds. So if a lady, an elderly old lady was angered in society back then, and then they say they cursed somebody, for example, then it was this act of mischief that the local kind of kangaroo court, if you will, local magistrate would have said was witch-like behaviour, and they would have been punished under that ruling. Some of the other kind of indicators for witches were things like witch marks. Kind of, we talked about the difference between natural and unnatural. The idea of unnatural markings of the skin, things like birthmarks, things like warts or whatever it might be, even piles and hemorrhoids were markers of witch marks. Often as well, to go back to the idea that they were often lonely women, this idea of familiars, so a cat or a pet of some sort, maybe a rat, something like that, they were often seen to be kind of demonic spirits, okay, and people thought that the familiars kind of fed on the blood of witches and then crept away and did the kind of nasty deeds, if you will. Witches were also people that would cast charms and spells, if you will, and a lot of these again were rooted in Catholicism and certain aspects of Catholicism following Henry VIII's change. So you can imagine that some people in society that had certain prayers passed down to them, for example, that were kind of considered to be Catholic prayers, those type of things. Now, if you were going around and chanting and reciting them, you could be labelled out as a witch. And also the idea of recovery after magic. If somebody had cast a spell on you, for example, and you could recover after that spell, then if you had the powers of recovery, then you could also be labelled as a witch. So these were some of the indications of what a witch was like, and witch-like behaviour and characteristics and traits in Jacobean society. So, that said, Shakespeare chooses to open his play of the Tragedy of Macbeth with the witches. Some important things to consider in this opening scene is that obviously whenever there is witches, there seems to be this kind of pathetic fallacy that follows them round, this sense of foreboding. There's always this idea of thunder and lightning to signal the end of their entry onto the stage. And they meet at the beginning in a deserted place. This links into what we were saying a second ago with the idea of these women often being marginalised on the fringes and edges of society. And as you see these three witches meeting here, the planning, if you will, to cause some mischief, not following any anger, but just planning to cause some sort of mischief and disruption to Macbeth's life, to Scottish society. And that's quite important because it sets off this play with this kind of, like I said, this dark gothic foreboding tone that they have. The audience would really have taken kind of notice here. It would have been a good way to hook them in and make them think, well, this is quite exciting. Before we even meet the title character of Macbeth, we're hearing about him from the mouths of these witches, so we would automatically associate Macbeth with the witches, and also with this sense of darkness. Just looking through some of this, we get the paradox from the us opening that fair is foul and foul is fair. We see them with supernatural qualities. They can hover through fog and filthy air. They don't walk like conventional natural human beings. They hover in a supernatural way. And again, they plan to meet upon the heath with Macbeth, another isolated place, not a social place whatsoever. They're again on the fringes, on the edges. And they also, there's two strange words here, Graymalkin and Paddock. They would have been perhaps names of animals, maybe cats or whatever it might be. Paddock calls, it might be the meowing of a cat, some kind of signal on stage that these witches have got familiars with them. Okay, so they do start to have this kind of stereotypical witch-like feel right from the off. They are three maybe elderly women. They're in a deserted place. They've got familiars, and they've got this supernatural ability to hover throughout. So they do set, like I said, this very gothic, dark, terrifying tone to the play. The next time we see them is Act 1, Scene 3, which again is still before we've met Macbeth. Again, we've got thunder to signal the entrance of the witches. They're again on a heath, and we get a little insight into their lives, if you will, and what they're like. So the first witch says, where hast thou been, sister? And the second witch says, killing swine, some kind of pig, some kind of cattle. Why? For fun, for disruption, again for mischief. This is what they did. They caused mischief, they caused disruption to society. They were chaotic characters, which is an important, perhaps, phrase to note down. And then we get a little bit more hearing of what the first witch has done. And the first witch commits this crime, if you will, of mischief following anger. Because what happens here, they're talking about a sailor's wife had chestnuts in her lap and she's eating them and eating them, munching and munching them. And the witch asks for some, like I say, these elderly women don't have much money or much food in society. She asks for some chestnuts and she's told no. So what she does is she curses them. She curses them and curses the sailors. The sailor himself who's on the sea. So this links into the episode that King James himself had suffered, and again would be a nice link back to make this idea that they can cause disruption. And again they've got this supernatural, but in a sieve, either the sail, this idea that she can get into some sort of sieve and mystically and magically either approach the boat in stealth, or she's doing it in kind of some kind of what can we say, kind of fantastical way through a cauldron or whatever it might be. But she is working very much on a supernatural level here, trying to seek revenge, to create some sort of mischief, following the fact that she feels that she's been wronged by not being able to have any of these chestnuts. As the first witch carries on, we see kind of the vengeful nature of these witches, and perhaps a little bit of how evil they can be with the supernatural doings, if you will. Because you see this little quotation in red here where she says, "He shall live, a man forbid." This is still talking about the sailor whose wife refused to give her some chestnuts. "He shall live, a man forbid. Weary 7 nights, 9 times 9. Shall he dwindle, peak and pine, though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed." So this idea that for several nights, if you will, he's going to be in the most horrendous storm at sea, and he's going to dwindle, he's going to peak, he's going to pine, he's going to be afraid, he's going to starve, and everything else that's going to go with it, and he's going to really, really suffer, and all because his wife wouldn't give the first witch a chestnut. So it seems like the punishment that the witches give out don't really go with the crime that's being committed against them, or not crime, but the injustice that's been committed against them. They're torn away from the enjoyment of the dishing out their punishment to the sailor with the sound of a drum, and the drum signals the coming in of Macbeth. Just before Macbeth and Banquo enter, they say that the charm's wound up, and the charm here is meaning the spell that they have cast, whether that be the spell upon the sailor that's out at sea, whose wife wouldn't give her a chestnut, or whether that be some kind of charm that they're planning for Macbeth. There's a little bit of uncertainty around that. Charms were important things, and again they could link to this kind of medieval Catholicism, if you will, and the chanting that went on in Catholic Church. So sometimes the charms could contain religious imagery. We'll talk about the spell later on, but this idea reinforces, the word charm reinforces the fact that these witches did have some kind of perhaps supernatural power. So enter Macbeth and Banquo then, and we get to see through Banquo's description how Shakespeare intended these characters of the witches to appear on stage, that look not like inhabitants of the earth. That very much fits with our supernatural theme. If you don't look like something that naturally belongs on the earth, then what do you look like? How do we start to stage that is a question for directors as well. But yet you live on it. And then the last bit here, Banquo is even confused by the gender. They are very transgressive characters in their kind of appearances. We can't tell if they're men or if they're women, if they're human, if they're not human. So they're very much on the boundaries and of society, of life, of humanity, because we don't know quite how to take these particular characters that we've encountered here. You should be women, yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. So again, their appearance would have been very, very strange to the Banquo and to Macbeth and to the audience as well that they've met. Maybe less so. Maybe this is intended as humorous. You could interpret it in that way, that you've got women that look like they've got full kind of facial hairs of beards, kind of freakish appearances, if you will, or you could talk about it in terms of the fact that it's not for humorous effects, it's for quite a perhaps the opposite of that kind of terrifying effect, and actually the appearances of these characters on stage are frightening, even to soldiers like Macbeth and Banquo. They are disturbed by it, and by just an ordinary lay audience, we would also be quite terrified by the appearance of these witches. So, appearances aside, the witches start, like I've said, the course of action in this play. They appear with three prophecies for the character of Macbeth. They tell him that he is the Thane of Glamis, which he is, and he knows. They tell him that he's going to become the Thane of Cawdor, which is a promotion for him as far as Macbeth is aware the Thane of Cawdor is alive. For the audience here, there's a sense of dramatic irony as we know that he's not. So we can see the natural progression for him there. And they tell him rather more juicily, the last one, that he's going to become the King of Scotland hereafter, which often sets off Macbeth with these kind of ambitious thoughts to become king. Stood there watching is Macbeth's best friend Banquo, and he says, well, if you can sow the seeds of time, and you can see to the future, which is then, what about me? Banquo's prophecies are slightly different, whereas Macbeth's are quite egocentric and they're just about Macbeth and what he's going to do. Banquo's are more about his family. And again, you've got Shakespeare here playing to the king. Banquo's an important character because King James could trace his own lineage back to the real life Banquo, so it was important that Banquo came out of this play in a positive light. And obviously that would have been quite pleasing to King James himself as well. There's no actual evidence to suggest that King James actually ever viewed this play or ever saw it in performance, but he was very much a king that enjoyed Shakespeare in the theatre. He did, when he became king, take over and became the sponsor of Shakespeare's play, and they changed the name to the King's Men then. But we can see in Banquo's prophecies here that although he's looking at the comparative adjectives here, he's lesser than Macbeth, but he's going to be greater. And again, that's a nod to King James. He's not so happy as Macbeth, but yet much happier. And he shall get kings, and that king and those kings that they're referring to finally culminates in King James himself. And then, true to supernatural form, they just vanish off stage and have gone. When they've vanished, they leave the characters with very different reactions. As you can see here from Macbeth's reaction, he says, "Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more." Macbeth, he needs answers. He's using imperatives, he's using commands. He's probably quite angry, quite frustrated. Yes, I'm going to become king. Then tell me how that's going to happen. Tell me when that's going to happen. So the witches really do drop in this little bit of mischief, this little bit of thought in Macbeth's head. They sow this seed, if you will, that he could become king. He may become king. He will become king. And Macbeth then, you have a decision to make as a reader of this, whether it's Macbeth's own free will or whether it's fate that drives him on to become king later on. Banquo's reaction then is contrasting, completely juxtaposing Macbeth's reaction, whereas Macbeth is, like I said, commanding and using imperatives towards the witches and what he's just heard and what he's just seen. Banquo's is much more of a kind of questioning tone, if you will. Were such thing here as we do speak about. He even questions whether the witches were even there, or whether it was a figment of their imagination. He talks about, have we eaten the insane root, which might have been reference to some kind of herb or some kind of leaf that they've eaten along the way back after this war or even before war, and it's made them hallucinate. And we know that Macbeth later on in this play has form for hallucinations. So if it wasn't for the character of Banquo, we could probably question whether the witches, seeing as Macbeth's the only character that sees them, whether the witches even exist at all, or whether they're part of Macbeth's imagination as well. And Banquo's final point there, his final question, is that takes reason prisoner. These are unreasonable things that they have seen. They're illogical, they're incomprehensible, they are supernatural things. Three women appear in front of them, give them three prophecies, and then vanish. And they look so strange and mystical as well. that actually these witches are beyond comprehension for Banquo for Macbeth and for the audience at this point. So even though we don't see the witches again till Act 3, Scene 5, which is a contentious scene because for some people and theorists and critics, they don't believe that Shakespeare wrote this. Some thought that he wrote it later and it was in the original play, but we see them and we kind of feel them throughout the play. So even though we've not seen them since Act 1, Scene 3, kind of the mischievous seeds that they've sown, the tamperings with Macbeth, and we see the chaos that and what that creates in society and Scottish society, is quite powerful. And I suppose Shakespeare is making a point here that the supernatural, if you dabble with the darker arts, can lead to quite powerful and chaotic outcomes. And really, there's a warning here to be careful and to not to do it really, and to reinforce what King James was saying. In this scene, Act 3, Scene 5, we see Hecate, who is the goddess of witches, witchcraft and magic, chastise, tell off, and get quite angry, if you will, with the three witches who have meddled with Macbeth's fate and destiny. And we learn a little bit more about Macbeth. Hecate refers to Macbeth as a wayward son, someone who's spiteful, someone who's angry, wrathful, and someone who loves for his own ends. So he's a selfish character. We're being told by a very, very evil character here that our hero, if you will, our tragic hero Macbeth, and we know this because of the regicidal acts and the murder he's committed so far, is not a good character. Okay, we should not be aspiring to be like Macbeth, even from the goddess of witchcraft and evil herself, Hecate, as well. And you've got reference here, and she tells the witches, she commands the three witches to go and sort this out. You've tampered with this, you've set Macbeth on this course of destiny, now you go and make amends, get you gone, and in the pit of Acheron. And this idea, Acheron is a river in hell, is where they plan to meet. So you see again these witches being rooted in evil, but even though they're rooted in evil, they still think that Macbeth is worse than them. So that kind of says everything that we need to know about Macbeth. So after being told off by Hecate, then the witches go to rectify, if you will, the errorous ways with Macbeth. Probably the most famous scene, the most famous quote, double, double, toil and trouble. If the witches at the beginning of the play, if Shakespeare presented them as unnatural perhaps, as abnormalities, then at the end of this play in Act 4, Scene 1, they're very much supernatural beings. They're gathered in a cave, so they're still on the fringe of society, and they're around a much more stereotypical view of a witch, a cauldron, throwing in lots of different witch-like ingredients. So let's have a look at what they put in that cauldron now. So in the cauldron, each witch throws a selection of things, and they're casting a spell. And you can see here in red this idea of charms again, and these would have linked back, as we've said, to kind of medieval Catholicism, if you will, and kind of charms that they had. There was a very famous religious chant, if you will, spell, charm, whatever you want to call it, called the 5-wound charm, which had links to the dissolution of the monasteries when Henry VIII decided to move away from the Catholic Church because he wanted divorce and set up his own Church of England. And again, lots of people died there. So some of these charms that they keep linking back to, we can link to Catholicism as well, because there was still this fear in society that with King James might come back some kind of Catholic way of life in Britain. And we've also got the Gunpowder Plot as well, which was the attempted Catholic overthrowing, if you will, to blow up Guy Fawkes, to blow up Parliament, so that they could reinforce a Catholic monarch onto the throne of Britain. So these idea of charms were dangerous spells. Okay, so they linked stereotypically to witches and them casting spells, but also they have, like I said, rooted in Catholicism, and what would be seen as a kind of societal evil, if you will. Then, looking at the green semantic field that we've got here, then across the witches are parts of animals that we perhaps wouldn't associate with eating, so I'm not sure why we put them in a pot. So you've got things like bats in there, you've got toads, snakes, all things that have thrown in there which are unpleasant. And again, the kind of animals I suppose we'd associate with witches a little bit more. Looking at the semantic field that's in blue, the dragon, the wolf, and the shark, well, these are more um, fantastical, but I suppose more fearsome animals, which goes with perhaps the power of these witches. Where would you get the scale of a dragon? How would you get a tooth of a wolf? Again, a part of a shark. So this idea that these witches are very almost kind of they seem to have grown in power as the play goes on, and that's quite important. If they've not physically grown in power and they've not grown in their witch-like power as the play goes on, they've definitely grown in their influence over Macbeth. Okay, and that's what they've met now to try and rectify, if you will, what they've done with Macbeth. I've just underlined on here as well, root of hemlock, which again would have been kind of a herb slash with kind of with the ability to make somebody hallucinate. So when we talked about the insane root at the beginning, I just thought this might be an important point to put back in here, that the root of hemlock could produce hallucinations, because what we're going to see in a second when Macbeth comes back in are more hallucinations. And you've also got this idea of the strange and the foreign, if you will, with the liver of the blaspheming Jew and nose of Turk. So we've got different nationalities, ethnicities, and religions here coming in and being thrown into this pot as well. And also quite some perhaps emotive imagery there. We've got the finger of a birth strangled babe put in there. So this is kind of horrible imagery that we can see put in there, quite emotive, that the finger of a baby that's been strangled at birth is a very unpleasant image. So these witches now, from being something that we were very much unsure of at the beginning of the play, are now much more stereotypical supernatural witches, and they've become quite fearsome and quite repulsive with the spell that they're throwing in here. So the spell is an important turning point. We see the growing danger, power of the witches within Macbeth's life, within the play, and by transposition within society as well. So Macbeth has gone back to see the witches, and we've talked about the fact that the witches now perceive Macbeth to be wicked. Just before Macbeth enters, we get, by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes, and then enter Macbeth. At the beginning, we see a change in Macbeth's character. Shakespeare changes Macbeth's character. The witches find Macbeth and cause some mischief. This time round, in Act 4, Scene 1, Macbeth seeks out the witches. One of the best questions a student has ever asked me was, how does Macbeth know where to find the witches, which is still unanswerable. So if anybody does know the answer to that and could let me know, I'd appreciate that. Here, though, we get the final falsehoods, if you will. The poetry uses a word, equivocate, to withhold the truth. And this is what the witches do here. This is part of their mischief, and this play, they withhold the truth. So they make three final prophecies, if you will, which is what Macbeth wants to hear. But this time they kind of absolve themselves of it. Where they all spoke their prophecies last time, Glamis, Cawdor, King. Here they have apparitions. So again, it shows those kind of sorcery, their power, if you will, but it also shows them distancing themselves. This is not more equivocation. This is not the witches saying it. These are these apparitions saying it. So therefore, it might not be quite as true. But they make three more prophecies. Beware Macduff, which is sound advice. None of woman born shall harm Macbeth. And the last one, nothing will happen to you, Macbeth, until great Burnham Wood moved to Dunsinane Hill. And so until the forest gets up and moves, then you will be safe. So this final falsehood, as I say, sets Macbeth off feeling like he's completely invincible, and actually we know as an audience that he's not. These are, like I say, evil, mischievous witches that are equivocating, that are lying to him, and not telling him the full truth. And Macbeth goes off fully believing them. He's very gullible here. We hear what he wants to hear as he goes in and out of his kind of psychotic state, from strong to weak, and he goes away thinking that he's invincible. The last thing, though, is quite important. Stage direction at the bottom that Shakespeare says, "A show of 8 kings, the last with a glass in his hand, and the ghost of Banquo following." So this idea that it would have been with a glass, he were probably talking about a mirror, and in the staging of it, that would have come right back to King James the First. So the glass in his hand would have been a reflection of the king himself, the current king, King James. So for that would have been a very pleasing and quite a dramatic, bold, dramatic thing to put into his play there. But it also reinforces to Macbeth that he has got no heir to pass on the throne to, and what the witches said about Banquo at the beginning shows that for Macbeth, power is fleeting and it's not something that he can hold on to, but he's so desperate to do so. So that was the last scene with the witches in, where they appear on stage. Like I said, although we feel like they're running throughout this play, they're not. They're only in a few short scenes, really. However, in the final scene of the play, there is reference to them and their work throughout here, and I've called this a bitter end because Macbeth at the end has realised that the supernatural has let him down, the witches have let him down, he's been lied to, they've equivocated to him, and he says on the battlefield as he goes to fight Macduff, feeling kind of invincible, even though that there is wood has moved, he can see that Burnham Wood's moved to Dunsinane Hill, he still feels invincible. He says, "I bear a charmed life, which must not yield to one of woman born." And then comes the final twist, if you will, the dramatic twist where Macduff reveals that he was untimely ripped from his mother's womb. And Macbeth then says, "Accursed be that tongue that tells me so, for that hath cowed my better part of man." That palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. So this very bitterness at the end, this is Macbeth's moment of realisation. He realises at the end of this play that everything the witches have said has not been true. It's been for their own entertainment, their own mischief, and Macbeth has fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. In terms of the supernatural, he's got himself wound up into believing that he's something that he's not, and he's had this final moment of realisation at the end. And this is a big warning to the audience: if you dabble with the dark arts, if you mess with the supernatural, bad things will happen, and ultimately it will lead to your tragic downfall. So we've talked about the witches and what they do and how Shakespeare presents them. Now we've got to think about how we write about them, and the most important thing when you're writing about the witches, the supernatural, whatever it is in any of your literature text, is you say why the writer has used that character, to what end, to what means. So I've given you a couple of sentences here to try and help you with your analytical writing. The first one I've kind of put from the beginning of the play. By opening the play with the witches, Shakespeare affirms a dark Gothic tone that foreshadows the tragic events that the audience are about to witness. And then one, to try and turn that phrase that a lot of us use in our writing, that I started this off with, that the witches are there for, if you will, a pleasing aspect for King James. So if you look at the second quotation, or the second sentence I've given you here, Shakespeare didn't include witches merely to please King James. Instead, he was reinforcing the political status quo and warning his audience against supernatural serendipity. So if you look at this, what I've tried to put into red for you here is the fact that there is Shakespeare, there is a writer behind this that's constructing it, that's making you feel these things, that's using these characters of witches for a purpose. And the other words I've put in there are verbs, because that's the action, that's what Shakespeare's doing. He's putting these witches in to try and elicit a response from you, whatever that will be. The fact that it's fear because it's dark and it's gothic, or because it's a warning that you shouldn't tamper or you shouldn't mess with supernatural beings. So please don't. So you've got to always say in your literature text why the writer is using the witches, the supernatural, or whatever it is that the question's asking you. Try and think about the methods, okay, and follow that formula of what, how, why. What is it the writer's doing? How, what methods, and then why. Why is the writer doing that? And the why is what will hopefully get you some more marks in your literature assessments.